And it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Blair Comley PSM, who's Secretary of the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet, and as you know, the state's most senior public servant. He's also in that capacity Chair of the Secretary's Board of the New South Wales Public Service. He's on various boards to do with the New South Wales Government, and I'm also pleased and proud to say that he's on the board of ANZSOG and made a great contribution there. As many of you will know, Blair also had a very distinguished career in the Commonwealth Public Service. He came to New South Wales having been Secretary of the Commonwealth Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism, but he was also previously Secretary of the Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency. He's had a number of senior positions in Treasury. In fact, it's not on his CV, but I can report, and Blair usually doesn't mind me saying this, that his very first job when he came to Canberra from Monash University, where he'd been a lecturer, was with the Old Industry Commission, working in the Office of Regulation Review. But we couldn't hold him for all that long. He was just too smart for us. And he moved on to Treasury, where he had a great career, moving right up in that important department. I also came across Blair from time to time at the OECD in Paris, where he spent 3 years. It's really tough, 3 years in Paris, Blair, but somebody has to do it. And again, you did it very well. And I remember having a discussion, I think, about competition arrangements in relation to shipping, international shipping. We had a vigorous debate of the kind you don't normally have in a foreign diplomatic mission. But of course, Blair's job there was handling the economic affairs and following what the OECD was doing. Look, the rest is in the booklet that you've got. I won't say any more than that, other than to thank you again, Blair, for taking the time to do this tonight and asking you all to welcome him to the podium.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room today. This is actually a very challenging thing to do, the sort of after-dinner speech, because you basically don't want me to be here. But I get that. I've reviewed the video from last year, and Chris only went for 40 minutes. And I've pruned down my initial draft to 39 so that you've had a chance. It's also sort of kind of interesting because I'm going to do something a bit risky for me, because what I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm about to take the SES from my department away for a retreat, second retreat to think about the department. And the themes of that are really the three themes that we're talking about as what you really need from leadership, which is clarity, clarity about what you're about, capability and the right environment. And just before I got up, Terry Moran, who's here, is a colleague of mine from Commonwealth Days, and you will all know Terry, encouragingly said to me, I can't do after-dinner speeches because I'm not funny enough, but good luck. So I thought that was pretty encouraging on the environment side. So I'm going to go for a joke first up, and then I'm going to segue not into policy but into management stuff, and hopefully say something vaguely interesting on the way. So I've only got one joke. So if you can just stay with me, it would be good if some of you laughed at the end. A travelling salesman. It's a Ronnie Corbett joke for anyone who ever got it, so you're in the right genre. A travelling salesman is away from home, and he rings up his wife and he says, look, is there anything you need to tell me? And his wife says, oh, look, unfortunately the cat's died. It gets less sad, it's okay. And he says, you can't just blurt out to me that the cat's died. You've got to emotionally prepare me for it. The first night I ring up, you should say to me, look, the cat's on the roof, but don't worry about it. we think it's going to be okay. And then the next day I ring up, you say to me, look, the cat fell off the roof, but we think it's going to be okay. I mean, it's a bit bruised, but okay. The next day I ring up, you say, oh, we've taken it to the vet. It's taken a bit of a turn for the worse, but we're still pretty confident. And the next day you say, oh, the vet's really not that confident. I don't want to keep your hopes too high, but we're pretty concerned. And then the following day, you tell me the cat's died. That's how you do it. Do you understand? Do you get where I'm coming from? She said, yeah, I understand. Is there anything else you need to tell me? And she says, your mother's on the roof. So, by my standards, I take that as success, so thank you. Actually, I've worked in organisations where that became, in fact, about 20 years ago, the joke of the division. And so the phrase was always, as we're warming a minister up to something, we've got to tell them the cat's on the roof. And then occasionally you forgot you hadn't told new inductees into the division the joke, and there'd be a conversation with the cat's on the roof and everyone looking blankly, what's going on? I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk a little bit about flexibility at work. And part of the reason I want to do this is I figure we've got a large number of some of the finest people in public policy in Australia, and there's never a bad time to promote the New South Wales government as a great place to work, particularly when they're a captive audience. So a while back, on International Women's Day this year, the Premier announced that the whole public service would be moving to an if not, why not approach to flexibility. What can any job be done flexibly? The presumption would be we could do it flexibly, and that we would find a way of doing that. We would do every role would have flexibility by 2019, which is pretty ambitious. And in the public service I grew up in, not that old, but in the early 90s, I remember going to an all-staff meeting at Treasury when someone asked the question about would we have some, better work-life balance. And Ted Evans was secretary at the time and replied something along the lines of, look, the first decade I was here, I worked pretty hard. Second decade, I worked pretty hard. Third decade, I worked pretty hard. It doesn't seem too bad to me at the moment, which wasn't very comforting. But we've already embraced this in the Department of Premier and Cabinet. In fact, one of the first things I did as secretary is say, well, all the jobs we advertise can be done on a flexible basis. And, it had quite an impact. And you might say, why do we want to have all jobs being flexible, potentially? And I think there's two reasons. The first is it gives you the best chance you can of having better diversity in the workplace. And I think that you're having a conference on hyper-government, and I think one of the themes of dealing with hyper-government is the plurality of society is increasing. So the narrower your perspective with an organisation, the more likely you are to miss something that's really important to a significant part of society. You're not likely to, in fact, have the capability to deliver the right outcomes, and you're probably not going to create the right environment. So I think that diversity is a key reason you want to make sure that your workplace practices are not a barrier to people coming into your organisation. And importantly, when we think about that flexibility, people immediately think about people with caring and family responsibilities, be they children or elder parents, often as the life cycle. But we would think about also with people with other interests outside work that need to be accommodated in that way. It should be across the board. That's the first thing. The second thing is we want to be an employer of choice. We want to say, why don't you come here and work in a very flexible environment? And my perception, at least, is, and I spent a brief time at PwC between the Commonwealth and New South Wales, that PwC was doing this a lot better than any organisation I'd worked in terms of that sense of not having a presenteeism culture, being flexible, allowing things to happen. And that's, in a sense, the group of many people we're trying to compete to be in the organisation. So we need to be an employer of choice. So they're the main motivations, apart from just being the right thing to do. The question is how to get there. And I think the evidence that we've got from where it's worked better in the private sector is there's a very clear message that you don't want a very prescriptive, rules-based engagement. What you actually want is bespoke conversations about what really works in terms of flexibility, but also understanding that we're not providing flexibility for flexibility's sake. We're here because we're here to deliver an outcome. In our case, the mission of the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet is to enhance the lives of the people of New South Wales by doing a range of things, brokering solutions, driving priorities and delivering programs and services. That's what we're here for, but we want to have the best group of people to do it. We're pretty clear that we have not yet skilled up the whole organisation to be able to have those conversations in a way that's going to lead to the right outcomes, because they can be, quite difficult conversations for people. So we've embarked on a program of training all the leadership group on how to have that conversations. We also provide training over time to the staff who might be asking for that flexibility. The other thing we've tried to be clear about is my very strong perception is that I know lots of managers who are very happy to provide flexibility to their staff, but will never ask for it for themselves. And if I'm honest about it, I'm probably in that camp. It's really hard. I sent a message to the staff talking about once being a little bit later than I normally would be for work, sort of walking past the gym, and a really important part of my work-life balance is being able to get to the gym, and thinking, oh, shall I go in? I'll be a little late. And I did go in, but I sort of felt guilty about it and skulked into the building. Now, I was dripping head to toe in sweat and I was in shorts and a T-shirt, so it's pretty clear I hadn't dashed back from a meeting. But it's trying to create that sense that it is not something you skulk back, but you say that's what's expected and you set the tone throughout the organisation. The other thing we've been doing is we've had pretty well the whole senior leadership group do unconscious bias training about, what is the models of leadership you think about. And for those of you who haven't done it, I mean, there are different types of this training, but the one we did, run by Melbourne University, you do a test before you go to the training, so that when they talk about we've all got unconscious bias and someone's sitting back there smugly, I know other people do, but that's not me. So they show you images at a very high speed of phrases and words and pictures, and the way it's set up is it reveals very quickly whether you associate males with a leadership type or females with a leadership type, and we actually went on domesticity bias, what you associate with caring responsibilities. And that's partly to get people in the mode of really thinking about, you've got to understand the baggage you bring to each conversation. The final thing related to this, and I think it reflects on the public service sort of taking advantage of flexibility and making it work. If I refer back to my brief experience at PwC, I think that one of the things that makes it work there is they have performance systems for individuals very well grounded in quantitative metrics that are relatively easy to measure and are genuinely pretty well correlated with the outputs of the business. Sort of utilisation, sales, revenue. And so that conversation that might be, oh, so-and-so nicked off early, are they really producing, becomes a bit moot when someone says, look at the measured outputs. And that's actually quite powerful. And it's not just powerful for junior staff, it's also powerful for the partner who happens to be, down the golf course or doing whatever they're doing, when they've got a metric that says, yeah, but look at the revenue under management, look at the sales. I can pretty easily demonstrate I'm pulling my weight in this partnership. Now, in the public sector, we've got very variable practice on performance management. We also, in many places, struggle to have those sorts of quantitative metrics that make sense. And if we created quantitative metrics in some areas, they would probably be misleading and counterproductive in many ways. So in many respects, we have to build more sophisticated performance management systems that are more thoughtful to the context and are genuinely related to what we're trying to achieve than you will when you have some of those other organisations there. But I think that's the flip side of flexibility. You have to get both sides of the equation right to make it work. So we're hoping that we're clear about what sort of workplace we want, that we can give people the capability to be able to have those conversations, and that creates the environment where we actually harness that diversity and get the best outcomes for the people of New South Wales. Now, one of the key KPIs is that I don't speak for too long. So as I've sort of reflected back on the initial joke, I think of two things. The first thing is I need to update the characters in the play to be slightly less stereotypical and move on from Ronnie Corbett, who was a great comedian but was of a particular era. And the second thing is I think back to the wife in the situation and think that there's an error of being clear about what she's trying to communicate, having the capability to do it empathetically, and having a better environment where she's not patronised by her husband over the phone. So, thank you.
Friends, on your behalf, it's a great pleasure to move a vote of thanks to Blair Comley, both in terms of ANZSOG and Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, and indeed all of us in the room. I think we would agree that Blair and the government that he leads have really cut a national figure in terms of their ability to be able to change the discussion, to be able to trial pathfinding new procurements, to do a whole range of things that for those of you in this room that are public administrators I think a very good case study on where Australia needs to go, on the types of mechanisms, the art and the science of public administration and public policy making. Whether you look at the reforms around recurrent services, whether you look around the case that's been led for the reform of the budget in New South Wales and so on, the Premier and the Cabinet always deserve the recognition for the leadership, but for those of us in this room who work within public administration, we know that they get the licence plate, and it's people like Blair Comley and the team that he brings together that has to keep the car on the road. So, Blair, I think you've served the Australia-New Zealand School of Government exceptionally well tonight with your observations. The reason that you are one of the most respected public administrators in this country at this point in time is because you've changed things on your watch and you've given the Cabinet confidence to continue to pull difficult reforms through. I think it's very useful in terms of the program that people have enjoyed today. I think it's also incredibly important in terms of creating a template and a pressure on other jurisdictions, on politicians in other places to lead and follow and permit the sort of process that we've seen here in New South Wales. Friends, I have to be even shorter given that I'm just doing the vote of thanks as a sponsor. Please join me in thanking Blair Comley. Please join us.
And by definition, I have to be really brief at this point. Could I add my thanks to Blair Comley and also to Brendan Lyon for that vote of thanks. Again, thanks, Brendan, to the IPA for sponsoring this part of it. The IPA has been a valued partner with ANZSOG in our infrastructure programs and so on. Tony Gomez, a number of the people in the room might have attended one of those. So that's been great. My only task really is to remind you that there's an 8 a.m. start tomorrow, but the advantage of that is we have quite an early finish. I think we finish about 3:30 or 3:45, so that's the motivation for getting up early. Thank you very much again for participating so well today. We've got a wonderful lineup tomorrow, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. So I'll see you back here at 8 o'clock in the morning. And could I ask you all, please, to join me again in thanking our conference speaker, Blair Comley.